History remembers him as the name of betrayal, a disciple who walked with miracles, yet chose deception, a man who sat at the table of truth, yet reached for darkness. Judas Iscariot is one of the most controversial figures in human history, not because of who he was, but because of what he did. For 2,000 years, his name has carried a weight few others have ever known. To call someone a Judas is to call them a traitor, a betrayal of trust, a collapse of loyalty, a moral failure that cannot be excused. Yet inside this story lies something deeply unsettling, because the betrayal of Judas did not exist in isolation. It is tied to the most important moment in Christian history, the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. And that is where the tension begins. If Judas had not acted, would the story have unfolded the same way? If there was no betrayal, would there have been an arrest? If there was no arrest, would there have been a cross? And if there was no cross, what becomes of the Christian idea of salvation? This is where theology collides with morality, where intention clashes with outcome, where human choice seems to intersect with divine purpose. Because somehow, the same act that is condemned as evil is also seen as part of a plan that changed the world. So we are left with a disturbing question. Was Judas simply a traitor acting out of greed and weakness? Or was he, knowingly or unknowingly, part of something far larger than himself? A role inside a story already moving toward its conclusion? And if his betrayal was used to fulfill a greater purpose, does that make it less evil? Or does it make the paradox even harder to explain? This is not just the story of a man who betrayed his teacher. This is the story of a single decision that sits at the intersection of free will, prophecy, morality, and divine intention. This is the paradox of Judas. To understand the paradox, we first have to understand the man at its center. Judas Iscariot was not a stranger to the story of Jesus. He was not an outsider who appeared at the end of the narrative. He was inside it from the beginning. He was chosen as one of the 12 disciples of Jesus Christ, part of the inner circle, the group closest to Jesus, the group entrusted with private teachings, shared meals, and intimate moments that were not given to the crowds. For years, Judas walked the same roads. He heard the same teachings. He witnessed the same miracles. He sat under the same voice that calmed storms and healed the sick. Outwardly, nothing about him marked him as the betrayer. In fact, in the eyes of the other disciples, Judas was trusted enough to be given responsibility. According to the gospel accounts, he was placed in charge of the group's money bag, a role that required a level of confidence and reliability, which makes the story even more disturbing. Because betrayal is expected from enemies, but not from those who sit at the table. The name Iscariot is often linked to his origin, possibly indicating he came from Kerioth, a town in Judea. If this is correct, Judas may have been the only disciple from that region, making him slightly different from the rest of the group who were largely Galilean. Some scholars suggest this difference may have influenced his perspective, although the Bible does not fully explain it. What we do know is that Judas was close enough to see everything, yet still became the one who would turn against it. And this raises an important tension early in the story. Was Judas always destined to become the betrayer? Or did something within him change along the way? The scriptures hint at multiple possible influences: disillusionment, greed, and even spiritual corruption. But they do not give a single clear psychological explanation. Instead, they leave space for interpretation. Which is why Judas remains so difficult to understand. Because on the surface he looks like any other disciple. But beneath that surface something was shifting. And whatever that shift was, it would eventually lead to the moment that changed his name forever. Before the betrayal, before the silver, before the kiss in the garden, Judas was simply one of the 12. And that is what makes what comes next so unsettling. No one wakes up as a traitor. And that is what makes the story of Judas Iscariot so difficult to reduce to a single motive. At some point something shifted. Not suddenly but gradually. Because Judas did not begin his journey as an enemy of Jesus Christ. He began as a follower, a listener, a witness to what many believed was the arrival of hope itself. So the question becomes, what changes a disciple into a betrayer? The Gospels do not give a full psychological profile, but they offer fragments, small clues that point toward inner tension. One of the most repeated themes is money. Judas is associated with financial responsibility within the group, and later with the 30 pieces of silver he receives for handing Jesus over. This has led many readers to conclude that greed played a role in his downfall. But greed alone may not fully explain it, because betrayal at this level is rarely just about money. Another possibility is disillusionment. Some scholars and theologians suggest that Judas may have expected a different kind of Messiah, one who would rise politically, confront Rome and restore Israel's independence. If that expectation existed, then Jesus' message of suffering, humility, and spiritual kingdom may have conflicted with what Judas thought he was following. In that case, the betrayal would not simply be about rejection, but disappointment. There is also a darker thread found in the gospel accounts: spiritual influence. In certain passages, it is described that Satan entered Judas, suggesting that his actions were not only human but also influenced by forces beyond him. Whether taken literally or symbolically, it adds another layer of complexity to his transformation. And yet, even with all these explanations, one truth remains clear: Judas was still present, still aware, still choosing. That is what makes him tragic rather than simple. Because if he had been an outsider forced into betrayal, the story would be easy to categorize. But instead, he remains inside the circle of trust, slowly moving from closeness to conflict, from participation to separation. This is how betrayal often begins in human terms. Not with a dramatic decision, but with small fractures in belief, small disappointments, small compromises, until eventually, the distance between intention and action becomes unrecognizable. And by the time Judas takes the final step, the decision no longer feels like the beginning of something, but the end of something that was already breaking. By the time the story reaches its turning point, the tension is no longer internal. It becomes action. Judas Iscariot makes a decision that will define his name for the rest of history. He goes to the religious authorities, and he offers them something unthinkable: the location of Jesus Christ. In exchange, the gospel accounts say he receives 30 pieces of silver. On the surface it sounds simple: a transaction, a payment for information, a betrayal priced in metal. But beneath that simplicity lies something far more complex. Because this is not just about money. This is about timing, opportunity, and a moment where inner conflict becomes irreversible action. The number itself, 30 pieces of silver, has echoed through centuries of interpretation. In ancient contexts, it represented the price of a slave. That detail alone has shaped how the betrayal is viewed, not just as a financial exchange, but as the reduction of something sacred into something transactional. A life weighed and measured. But even here, the deeper question remains: why now? Why does Judas act at this moment after years of following Jesus, witnessing miracles and hearing teachings about love, forgiveness, and the kingdom of God? The Gospels suggest urgency, a convergence of events, tension building between Jesus and the religious authorities, the growing inevitability of confrontation. And in that atmosphere, Judas becomes the catalyst. But whether he sees himself that way is unclear. Did he believe he was simply helping the authorities arrest a controversial teacher? Did he think Jesus would escape as he had done before? Or was he fully aware that this act would lead to death? The text does not give us certainty, only consequences. And those consequences unfold quickly. From this moment onward, the story moves toward the garden. A place that should have been quiet. A place meant for prayer. A place where loyalty should have been unquestioned. Instead, it becomes the setting of the most infamous identification in history: the kiss of Judas. A gesture that transforms intimacy into betrayal. A sign that should have meant peace, now used as a signal for arrest. And in that moment, the contradiction becomes complete. A disciple does not point out a stranger. He identifies his teacher. Not with a weapon, but with closeness itself. It is one of the most emotionally disturbing images in the entire narrative. Because betrayal is not always loud. Sometimes it looks like trust. And once Jesus is arrested, the chain of events that leads to the cross is set in motion. But even here, the story refuses to become simple. Because while Judas' action is the trigger, it is not the end of the meaning. It is only the beginning of the moral tension. Was this simply betrayal? Or was something larger unfolding through it? Something that no single participant fully understood at the time? That question leads us into the most difficult part of the narrative. Was Judas' action purely evil? Or was it somehow woven into a divine purpose that he could not fully see? At this point in the story, interpretation becomes unavoidable. Because whatever theological meaning people assign to the betrayal, one truth remains consistent across the Gospels. Judas Iscariot is held morally responsible for what he does to Jesus Christ. And from a moral standpoint, the act itself is difficult to defend. Betrayal, by its very nature, is not neutral. It is the breaking of trust from within. And that is what makes it more serious than external opposition. An enemy fights you openly. A betrayer stands beside you first. In Judas' case, the violation is not just political or social. It is deeply relational. He is not handing over a stranger. He is handing over someone he has followed, learned from, and lived beside. This is why, in traditional Christian interpretation, the act is described as evil, not because it leads to a difficult outcome, but because of what it is in itself. The issue of intention. One of the central principles in moral reasoning is that intention matters. Even if an action leads to unintended good consequences, the moral weight of the action is determined by what the person intended at the moment of decision. And in the case of Judas, the intention is not portrayed as righteous. Whether motivated by greed, disillusionment, or confusion, the choice to betray Jesus is framed as a moral failure, a turning away from loyalty, a violation of trust, a conscious decision to cooperate with forces opposed to Jesus' immediate safety. Why outcome does not justify action. Some interpretations of this story raise a difficult idea. If the crucifixion leads to salvation, does that make the betrayal acceptable? Most theological traditions strongly reject this conclusion, because if evil becomes justified by its outcome, then morality collapses into hindsight logic. Under that framework, a deception could be justified if it leads to truth. A violence could be justified if it leads to peace. A betrayal could be justified if it leads to redemption. But Christian ethics does not operate that way. Instead, it draws a strict line. God can bring good out of evil, but evil is still evil. This distinction is crucial for how Judas is understood. The emotional dimension. There is also something deeply personal in the way the story is told. Because Jesus does not describe the betrayal as a necessary act of heroism. He describes it as betrayal. The language of grief, loss, and lament appears around it, which suggests that, within the narrative itself, the act is not redefined as good simply because of what comes after. It is experienced as wrongdoing, the responsibility of choice. Even within theological debates about prophecy and divine foreknowledge, Judas is never portrayed as a passive object. He acts, he decides, he participates, and that is why moral responsibility is attached to him. Because regardless of what God may bring out of the situation later, the decision itself still originates in human will. And in that moment, the will is directed toward betrayal, the weight of consequence. After the arrest, the story does not immediately shift to redemption or explanation. Instead, it moves into collapse, regret, isolation, and the realization that something irreversible has occurred. But before we reach that stage, one thing must remain clear. From a moral perspective, without theological reinterpretation, Judas' act stands as a betrayal in its purest form, a violation of trust, a deliberate handing over of an innocent man to his enemies. And that is why, in nearly every ethical framework, the action itself is judged as wrong. But Christianity does not stop there, because the next question is even more difficult. The act is evil. How can it still be connected to a divine plan? This is where the story becomes uncomfortable for many readers. Because up to this point, the narrative has been morally clear. Judas Iscariot betrays Jesus Christ. The act is condemned. The responsibility is real. The outcome is tragic. But then Scripture introduces another layer that complicates everything. The idea that this betrayal did not happen outside of divine awareness. In multiple passages, Jesus predicts that he will be handed over, rejected, and crucified. The events are not presented as surprises to God, but as part of a larger redemptive narrative unfolding toward a known conclusion. And this creates a tension at the heart of Christian theology. If God knew this would happen, if it was foretold, if it was woven into prophecy, then what exactly was Judas doing? Christian theology makes an important distinction here. God's foreknowledge does not mean coercion. In other words, knowing an event will happen is not the same as forcing it to happen. From this perspective, Judas acts freely. Judas is responsible for his choice. Yet God already knows the outcome of that choice, and somehow both truths exist at the same time. The most common theological explanation is that God can work through human actions, even sinful ones, to accomplish a greater purpose. Not by approving the evil, but by transforming its outcome. So in this framework, Judas intends betrayal. The religious leaders intend elimination of a threat. The Roman authorities intend political control. But behind all of these human motivations, a larger narrative is unfolding. One that leads to the crucifixion and, in Christian belief, the salvation of humanity. Christian theology does not treat the death of Jesus as an accident or interruption. It is central. It is the moment through which redemption is achieved. So the betrayal, as painful and morally wrong as it is, becomes one of the human mechanisms through which that central event is brought about. Not because it is good, but because it becomes part of how the story reaches its intended climax. Some passages in the Gospels suggest that betrayal was not only foreseen but spoken about in advance. Jesus refers to the fact that one of his own will betray him. This creates a sense of inevitability in the narrative, not in a way that removes human responsibility, but in a way that frames the event as already accounted for within divine knowledge. This is where theology begins to stretch human categories, because in normal human reasoning, responsibility and inevitability do not comfortably coexist. But in this story they are placed side by side. From this perspective, Judas becomes part of a chain of events that leads to a predetermined theological outcome. But this is where interpretation divides. Because saying Judas fulfilled God's plan does not mean he was morally justified, he understood the plan, or he acted with divine approval. It means something more restrained. His actions, freely chosen, were incorporated into a plan he did not fully see. And so the contradiction remains. If Judas was fulfilling prophecy, does that reduce his guilt? If God used his actions, does that change the nature of those actions? If the outcome is salvation, does the path to it become any less dark? Christian tradition generally answers, no. The evil remains evil. The responsibility remains human. But the outcome is still redemptive. And holding all of that together is where the paradox begins to sharpen. Because now we are no longer only asking what Judas did. We are asking how divine purpose can pass through human failure without becoming dependent on it. And that question leads directly into the next stage of the story. Was Judas simply fulfilling prophecy? Or did he have real freedom in the moment he made his choice? At this stage of the story, the focus shifts away from actions and into something deeper: control. Because once you introduce the idea that the events surrounding Jesus Christ were foretold, a difficult question emerges about the man at the center of the betrayal. Judas Iscariot. Was he truly free? Or was he moving within a script already written? Christian theology holds two ideas at the same time, even though they appear to clash. 1. Humans make real choices. 2. God is fully aware of all outcomes in advance. This creates a tension that philosophers and theologians have debated for centuries. Because in normal human experience, if something is known in advance, it feels fixed. If something is fixed, it feels unchangeable. If it is unchangeable, it feels like freedom disappears. But the biblical narrative refuses to remove either side of the equation. Judas chooses. And yet the story unfolds as something already anticipated. Throughout the gospel narrative, Jesus speaks of betrayal not as speculation, but as something that will happen. This introduces the idea that the event is not outside divine awareness. But prophecy raises another question. Does foretelling an event make it inevitable? Or does it simply reveal what will freely occur? This is where interpretations diverge. One major theological position is that Judas acted freely. From this view, he was not forced. He was not controlled. He made decisions based on internal desires and external pressures. In this framework, prophecy does not cause action. It simply reveals it ahead of time. Like observing a path from above without interfering with the traveler. Judas still owns the choice, and therefore still owns the responsibility. Another interpretation emphasizes divine sovereignty. From this view, nothing occurs outside the scope of God's overarching plan. The events leading to the crucifixion are not random or reactive. They are part of a structured unfolding of redemption. In this framework, a Judas betrayal is foreknown. His role is integrated into the narrative. The outcome is not uncertain to God. But even here, most theological traditions stop short of saying Judas is merely a puppet, because removing human responsibility would undermine moral accountability entirely. So the story holds both truths in tension. Judas is responsible for his actions. The events were foreknown within divine purpose. The betrayal contributes to a larger redemptive outcome. Yet the betrayal remains morally condemned. And none of these points cancel the others. Instead, they sit side by side, unresolved, unmerged. That's why this matters. This is not just a theological debate about one man. It touches a deeper human question. How much of our lives are truly our own? When we make decisions, are we fully autonomous? Or are we moving through a larger structure we cannot fully see? Judas becomes a focal point for that question because his story sits at the intersection of intention and inevitability. He acts, but the story feels like it is already moving toward its conclusion. In the narrative, Judas does not operate in isolation. He is influenced by fear, expectation, disappointment, opportunity, and spiritual pressure. And in moments like that, human freedom does not always feel like absolute independence. It feels like choice under weight, choice under tension, choice under pressure, which makes the betrayal not less voluntary, but more complex. And so we arrive at the heart of the struggle. If Judas was free, then he is fully responsible. If he was foreknown, then his role was already accounted for. And if both are true at the same time, then what exactly do we mean when we say an action is necessary? That question leads directly into the next chapter. Was Judas not just a participant in prophecy, but a necessary evil within it? At this point in the story, the question is no longer just about what happened. It is about whether it had to happen this way at all. Because once the betrayal of Judas Iscariot is linked to the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, the logic of necessity begins to appear. Not moral necessity, but narrative necessity. The idea that within the unfolding of events, Judas' role became a critical link in a chain that leads to something far greater. But does that mean the betrayal was required? The meaning of necessary. The phrase necessary evil is often used carefully in philosophy and theology because it can easily be misunderstood. It does not mean the evil becomes good. And it does not mean the person is excused. Instead, it usually means this. Given the way events unfolded, a morally wrong action became part of the path leading to a desired outcome. But even that definition raises problems, because it immediately creates a moral tension. If something is necessary for a greater good, does that reduce its guilt? Christian tradition generally answers, no. The argument that it was not necessary. One major theological position is rooted in the power of God. If God is truly omnipotent, then he is not limited to one pathway. He is not forced to rely on human betrayal. He could accomplish redemption through any number of means. From this view, Judas was not necessary in an absolute sense. The betrayal was not required for God's plan to succeed. It was simply the path that occurred within human history. The argument that it was necessary within the story, the opposing perspective focuses not on divine limitation, but on narrative unfolding. Within the actual timeline of events, Jesus is handed over. The authorities move against him. The crucifixion takes place. From this angle, Judas becomes the catalyst that sets those final events in motion. Without the betrayal, the arrest may not have occurred in the same way. The timing may have shifted. The chain of events may have taken a different form. So in a practical, historical sense, Judas becomes a key turning point. Not because the universe demanded it, but because the story as it unfolded passed through him. The danger of calling evil necessary. This is where theology becomes careful. Because labeling an action as necessary can unintentionally sound like justification. But Christian moral teaching draws a strict boundary. An evil act does not become good simply because God can bring good from it. This means, Judas is not praised. The betrayal is not honored. The moral weight of the action remains intact. Even if the outcome is understood as part of a redemptive narrative, the paradox deepens. So we are left in a difficult space. Judas is not absolved. The betrayal is not approved. And yet the outcome of the betrayal is inseparable from the central moment of Christian salvation history. This creates a tension that cannot be easily resolved. If God can bring redemption through betrayal, then what does that say about the relationship between evil and purpose? And if Judas played a role in that unfolding, was he simply a tool of circumstance? Or a willing participant in something far more complex than he could understand? The idea of necessary evil collapses under pressure when applied too rigidly, because it tries to merge two things that resist merging. A moral judgment, this was wrong. A narrative outcome, this led to something greater. And Christianity, in most interpretations, refuses to collapse one into the other. Instead, it holds both at once. The betrayal is still betrayal, and the redemption is still redemption. But the path between them remains morally unresolved. And so we reach the edge of understanding. We have seen the man, the betrayal, the moral weight, the prophecy, the question of freedom, and the idea of necessity. Now only one question remains. How can one event be condemned as evil and still be woven into a story that changes the world? That final tension brings us to the last chapter, the paradox of Judas itself. By this point, every attempt to simplify the story has collapsed. Because the life of Judas Iscariot does not sit neatly in one category. It resists reduction. It resists a single label. It resists a final explanation. And that is why it becomes a paradox. On one hand, the narrative is morally clear. Judas makes a decision. He betrays Jesus Christ. He receives payment. He identifies his teacher to those who will arrest him. From a moral standpoint, the action is condemned as betrayal, an internal violation of trust that cannot be justified by outcome. And yet, on the other hand, the same sequence of events is woven into a story that Christianity understands as central to salvation history. A story where the crucifixion is not a tragic accident, but a redemptive necessity. So we are left holding two realities at the same time. Judas acts freely. The Judas is morally responsible. The betrayal is wrong. And also, the betrayal is foreknown. The betrayal is used within a larger divine purpose. The betrayal leads into the central moment of redemption. Neither side cancels the other. Instead, they coexist in tension. The impossible balance. If we emphasize only morality, Judas becomes a simple villain, a man defined entirely by failure. But that explanation struggles to account for the theological depth surrounding his role. If we emphasize only divine purpose, Judas risks being reduced to an instrument. A character without agency, whose actions are predetermined and therefore stripped of real moral weight. But that explanation struggles to account for the repeated biblical emphasis on responsibility and guilt. So neither interpretation fully contains him. The real paradox is not just about Judas. It is about how meaning itself works in the Christian narrative. Because Christianity repeatedly presents a pattern. A human evil is real. Human choice is real. A human responsibility is real. And yet, God can bring redemption through those very choices. Without approving the evil. Without removing accountability. Without breaking the moral structure of the act. This creates a framework where intention and outcome are separated, but still connected. And Judas becomes the most concentrated example of that tension. The emotional weight of the story. There is also something deeply human in this paradox. Because Judas is not distant from us in the narrative. He is close. He listens. He walks. He participates. He is trusted. And then he falls. Which makes the question uncomfortable, not just theological, but personal. How does someone so close to truth become the instrument of betrayal? And what does that say about human nature itself? Even after centuries of interpretation, the story does not resolve cleanly. Instead, it leaves us with a structure that refuses closure. Judas is condemned. Yet his action is absorbed into a redemptive plan. He is responsible. Yet his role is foreseen. He acts freely. Yet his actions align with prophecy. And all of these statements remain true at the same time. The paradox of Judas forces a confrontation with a deeper reality. That history is not always morally simple. That intention and outcome do not always align. And that even actions defined as evil can become part of a larger story without being redefined as good. Judas does not become a hero. But he also cannot be reduced to a simple villain without losing the complexity of the narrative he belongs to. He remains suspended between categories, not because the story is unclear, but because it is too complex to be contained in a single moral label. And that is the paradox. The story of Judas leaves us with questions that do not disappear easily. Was he simply a traitor acting out of weakness and desire? Was he fulfilling a role within a divine plan he could not see? Or was he both, a free moral agent whose choices were woven into a purpose far larger than himself? Christianity does not resolve this tension by choosing one answer. Instead, it holds the tension in place. Because in that tension lies one of its central mysteries. That good can emerge from evil without evil becoming good. That human freedom can exist alongside divine foreknowledge. And that even betrayal can become part of a story that Christians believe changed the world. If this story made you think differently about Judas, then the real question is not just what he did. It is what we would have done in his place. And how often in life we may act without fully understanding the weight of what we are part of. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the paradox of Judas, consider liking the video, subscribing, and sharing your thoughts in the comments below. Because the conversation about Judas is not really about the past. It is about how we understand choice, responsibility, and meaning today.